All right, I'm joined by Joey Brody, who I've known actually for a few years, but it's great to finally talk to you about hockey and about the AHL. I guess before we start, Joey, why don't you introduce your background or your knowledge of? I think a good place to start is your knowledge about the AHL and hockey in general.
And for me, AHL is sort of something I have to know, I guess, the bare minimum about. It's not something I'm extensively, knowledgeable in. I am a huge NHL fan, so I'm always trying to just understand the mechanics of the AHL because it's the minor leagues for hockey. I'm always playing like the video game AHL, whatever edition it is, 16, 20, 24, doesn't really matter. And I've always, just by happenstance, I think anyone playing that game, you're more likely to scroll into the AHL filter and you're noticing a lot of teams. So, just a few names I could name off. There's the Syracuse Crunch, I believe. There's the Grand Cedar Rapids.
Grand Rapids Griffins,
Oh,
but yeah,
Grand
sorry.
Rapids Griffins, sorry. And there's the there's also Providence Bruins,
Yeah.
Scranton Wilkes-Barre Penguins, and then of course the HL for my team, New York Rangers, the Hartford Wolfpack. So yeah, I basically understand that much. That
Mhm.
the top prospects, except for obviously people in the top of the first round, are probably going to end up there their first few years. Like Rangers goalie Igor Shesterkin was in the HO Wolfpack for like 7 years because goalies take a longer time to develop, just as an example. Yeah.
Yeah, there's usually the prospects that, especially goaltenders, they take a while to develop, so they're in the AHL. Some of them actually spend some time in the ECHL. Yeah, I noticed. I should have mentioned that you're a Rangers fan. It's quite obvious from the hat and the jersey that you're a Rangers fan, and their affiliate is the Hartford Wolfpack. I'll ask you, on average, how many games would you say AHL games do you feel like you watch in a year, or how much AHL in general, whether it's YouTube clips or put something on Twitter or social media that you see, and it's like, all right, there's a highlight from a top prospect in the AHL. What would you say your ballpark estimate for how much AHL action, or really specifically even Hartford Wolfpack action, you watch in a year?
That's a really good question, Mike. I would say this is good because I don't I feel like someone as basic as me in terms of AHL is not watching full games. But I am watching clips because I'm a person every day that likes to go on Reddit. So I love going on subreddits of the teams I follow, whether it's the Giants or the Knicks or the Yankees, or in this case the Rangers. And every day I check it, and most of the time when they're considering calling up a prospect, like this year with Gabe Perreault, or that was more last year, Gabe Perreault or Rempe or Will Cooley, guys like that. There's always someone on Reddit on that subreddit for Rangers pulling up clips of them in the AHL. There's always clips like that. We're saying, "Oh, look what he did! Look what he did!" So I always check those out because it helps me get excited for their NHL prospects. That look what they're doing in the NHL. They're tearing it up. Now they're ready to go to the next level. So I don't know, like less than 10%, but it is in there. It is in there that I'm looking at clips of the AHL for sure.
I'd probably say you're not really watching the game. You're not really all you're all, more importantly, you're not going to Hartford to watch the
Definitely
Wolfpack
not.
per se. You're definitely
I'm
not
not going
doing
to
that.
Connecticut. No, 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 thank you.
uh, but I guess that's the follow up is how closely you'd say you'd follow the prospects or how much you know because that's the a lot of people follow the AHL. They follow for the prospects and primarily for the prospects. So how much would you say you know about the prospects in Hartford right now? I mean, because Gabe Perreault got called up, he was one of the players you probably were following earlier in the season. There's a few names there now, but how many would you say? First of all, how many do you know? Could you name off the top of your head? And second, like how many do you really know much about them?
Right. So like the most people I know from Hartford are the ones that have been at least called up once during the season, like Noah Laba, he's a big up and coming prospect. I do know also like I imagine like a lot of these players, I'm not even sure how many of them are in the AHL because I don't know exactly the rules between the OHL, CHL. If you're drafted, are you automatically in the AHL or can you play another year in the WHL or the CHL or the OHL? I'm not entirely sure.
It's actually a
Because there's a guy,
fascinating.
Brody Lamb, he was drafted a few years ago for the Rangers. There's a bunch of players like that, like anyone drafted the last few years. So like I'm always wondering, are they going? Like there's a guy, Ryder Korzak, he's another one. Bobby Trevino. I don't even know. Like again, with prospects, it's hard to remember all of them. So I'm not even sure how many of these guys are still in the system or if any of them are in the AHL. But I remember draft picks, so I assume some of them are in the AHL still.
It's
Um,
actually fascinating that the rule it's actually a rule that people don't really understand, including, I mean, it took me a few years covering the AHL to understand exactly how what it's like. They're changing it in the future, which is you have to be 19 or older to be in the AHL. So a lot of times a player gets drafted, either they go to the NHL right away or they have to wait in the OHL or in college for a year or two sometimes, and then they go to the AHL, then the NHL. So it's actually very complicated to understand. I think the NHL is trying to bridge the gap a bit with the AHL there, but it is interesting because you remember those players that were drafted, and you're like, where are they now? And then you realize afterwards that it's like, oh yeah, they're in the AHL, but they haven't really done much. It's players that what's fascinating to me is the players like Dylan Robrick, for example, who's in Hartford. He's part of their team, and obviously is a prospect that you want to see develop there, but he's not there now. So it's like a player like him. Like, I don't know how much you know about him or how much you follow him. There are players like Brett Berard and Brennan
right. I
Othman.
know who that is.
They've been
Yes.
up and down, so they're the type of players that you kind of know, but you don't really know. You know them from their NHL experience. You don't really know them from their AHL background. It's kind of fascinating
Exactly. Yeah,
for me.
that's right.
So I guess like one of the things I guess pivoting a bit from Hartford is just an outsider's perspective. What do you think is has been a big storyline in the AHL? I mean, you probably don't follow the league as much, but just like if I were to tell you, all right, tell me something about the AHL. What's been going on this season? What comes to mind, or what do you think about?
I personally try to think about just Hartford, not just me, because it's hard enough to follow a major sports league at the NHL because there's 32 teams. So I'm not worried about who's playing, who's the star for the Syracuse Crunch or this Hershey Bears or this or any of the. It's really hard to follow because they already have 82 games for now, sorry, now 84 for the NHL. You also have uh Olympic Games now. That's some extra games in the schedule. And when I have sometimes I even try to include World Juniors in there and not that many I'm not even sure how many AHL players are in the World Juniors. I imagine it's more OHL, CHL players, but yeah, like it's not easy to follow. I can tell you that much. Yeah.
It's one of those leagues. It's kind of what's fascinating about it because it's one of those leagues that you if you follow it, if you're covering a lot of games or watching a lot of games, where then you really it's a chain reaction, which is really interesting because oh, what's really interesting also is when a player gets traded, like let's say the Rangers trade a player, and then it's like get back a prospect, and you're like, where is this prospect playing? You want to find out, and if they are from another AHL team, you try to find out what their background is and stuff like that. I I want to ask you a bit of what do you think maybe some of the issues are with the AHL? If you know any issues that they're dealing with that are big picture question marks or really just things in general that you feel like the AHL, the league is trying to navigate.
I think a problem with the AHL, like just as a concept, is it's more of just a one. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's more of just one level. Like in baseball, you know how good a player is progressing for sure when they're promoted from single A to double A, eventually to triple A. So once they're at triple A and they've already done what they can do, you know that they're major league ready, and they're not really getting sent down to triple A unless, they're having a slump or they're injured or something like that, just to rehab stint type thing. So I feel like the AHL could benefit from something like that if they had more levels, unless they do already or unless the OHL or the CHL or WHL are like those other levels in their eyes. I'm not sure. It seems
Well,
like
I
it's just
could
one.
I could tell you that just the NHL is obviously the top level. It's kind of like major leagues. Baseball and hockey have a similar sort of tier ranking, if you will, where you have the major leagues, you have the professional league. The AAA and AHL are kind of similar, except for the difference is when a player's below that tier, the ECHL is the tier below that, which it used to be ECHL was the East Coast Hockey League, but now it's just generally called the ECHL because there are teams not on the East Coast in that league. Let's just be blunt about that. So it's kind of the double A version of it. And those players, if you're in the ECHL, unless you're a goaltender, very rarely do those players make it to the NHL. Yeah, it's very rare that a player's that
Fun
good.
fact, the Rangers had an ECHL team, I believe, called the Hartford Whale. Whale? Something Whale? I believe it was
Or
called that.
maybe the Connecticut Whale. I think
Connecticut Whale.
they're
And
you know what's
Jonathan
funny is
Marchessault was one of their prospects.
what's funny is their ECHL affiliate now is Bloomington, Illinois, and I think you want to talk about issues. I think something that's interesting is that a lot of teams want to move their ECHL affiliate closer to where their NHL team plays. You look at, I think the Devils moved their ECHL affiliate to Trenton that recently because they want to have it close by. Because when you send a prospect down, you could send them maybe down to the ECHL, and there's a whole bunch of benefits to having your ECHL team close to your AHL team and NHL team. It's interesting because the Rangers ECHL team is in Bloomington, Illinois, and some talk about maybe they'll want to move their affiliate closer to New York. I want to ask you maybe because obviously you're not thinking about what big storylines there are in the league, but what would you say you'd be following in the AHL, if at all? What would you follow as the season goes on? Because it's interesting. The AHL's at the All Star break, so now they're heading towards the home stretch. What would you say you'd be following as the season goes on?
Well, I think now that you're telling me that that's the All-Star break, I would look at who the All-Stars are and see potentially who could get called up to play for their NHL teams, you know? Or you always wonder when certain teams are playing so well in the AHL, is the player that good that he should just be promoted? Or if their team's in a playoff run for the AHL, should you just keep him? Because I remember 2020, Igor's last year in AHL, they didn't call him up right away. They wanted to see, they were on a winning streak, I believe, so they were trying to let him play as much as possible. And, they were in a playoff run. So they were trying to keep that core together, I remember. But eventually in January, when Henrik got really old, they decided, you know what, we're going to have to call up Igor. And that would have been more fascinating to see if it wasn't for the pandemic. But because he was on a hot streak at that when he got called up that first year. But yeah, I always find that interesting. Like because like for me, like when I'm watching, I don't watch that many college sports, but I'm always watching the end of March Madness, the last 2 rounds of college football, because I want to see who are the people that are going to stand out, who are those dogs, as you say, DAWGS, that are going to have that championship pedigree, the guys that can take you over the top. So I believe you can find that in college football. I believe you can find that in AAA of baseball, and I believe you could find that in the AHL. You can find those diamonds in the rough. Yeah, for
And
sure.
I think what's fascinating, you're mentioning this, and a lot of teams that have those prospects, one of the things that they try to balance is whether they want to bring them the last month of the season, April, whether they want to bring them onto the NHL team, a player who's plays in college hockey, and college hockey season ends early April, mid-April. Whether they bring them onto the NHL team for a handful of games, or they bring them onto the AHL team for a playoff push if the team is in a playoff race. And it is interesting because I'm looking at some teams that have those prospects in college or wherever they are, and it's going to be interesting to see how they navigate it. And well, if they're in a playoff push to possibly put them in there into a playoff run, it's gonna be fascinating to see. I mean, that's something I have kind of bookmarked, but obviously, it is something that for general hockey fans, especially when your team's not in the playoffs, which for the Rangers, they might. I don't think they're making the
Yeah,
playoffs
I
right
might have to
now.
start watching Hartford games at this point. I don't know, like just to
Yeah,
feel something. But I want to just point something out also because you clicked this in my mind. I've always been interested because of the AHL when teams, I don't even know if it's just the AHL, but just in general, when teams call up their prospects and their first game is a playoff game. I believe Chris Kreider was one of those players that he first started playing like toward the end of the season. I think his first game might have been a playoff game or something like that. It was like very late in the season. So I'm always wondering like how much faith you have in a player, like a rookie, to just play their first few games in the playoffs. I've always been fascinated by that. Like he must be really good in whatever levels, where it's NCAA or AHL or whatever. Another thing I want to point out before you comment on this, it's more of a question. Since it's called the AHL, do Toronto, Montreal, all those teams in Canada, do they have AHL affiliates? Is that just a weird thing? I don't know. Like, I'm just
no, yeah,
curious.
they have affiliates. They like the Toronto team as the Toronto Marlies, and
They're in
the
the American Hockey League.
yeah, it's funny because I think back in the day there was the AHL and NHL, and there was also an IHL. There was a bunch of leagues that were competing. But long story short, a bunch of leagues were competing against each other before the AHL kind of became the minor league affiliate of the NHL. There was all these competing leagues,
Mm.
and I think the IHL was the International League. There was the Western Hockey League for the NHL and WHL were the Western Hockey League, not the Western, the World Hockey League were competing against each other. World Hockey Association. It's basically like it's a long way of saying that. To clarify, the AHL was the American Hockey League. I think a fun fact about that is the Rochester team is called the Americans, and nobody knows definitively why. But a theory to why they're called the Americans is because they were the Montreal Canadiens affiliate, and the Canadians were in Canada, and the American and Rochester was their affiliate. So they were like, we'll call them the Rochester Americans. It's a theory. It's not something that's proven, but it's something that a lot of people point to, saying that's the reason they're called the Rochester Americans. But it is fun fact. You mentioned Chris Kreider. It's Kale McCarr was a player that was in college, and then after college, he was able to join the NHL team, the Colorado Avalanche. I think were his first game. So it happens once in a while. I think but with AHL players, it's a little different because I think you need to be on the NHL roster or on the transaction roster before the trade deadline. So it's a whole. It's also like that's the other part to it. It's hard to follow the transaction logs. It's hard to follow transactions. It makes it harder to follow, I think, the league because you want to follow the prospects, but you don't know where they are, and then the transactions don't make it easy and stuff. Um, that's all we got, Joey. Thank you for joining. It's really a pleasure talking hockey, and I know you're not so affluent in the AHL, but it's a pleasure talking to you about the AHL.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Mike. I appreciate it.
All right, we'll talk soon.